double album that opens with proof that the band exists and closes with proof that it shouldn't exist without itself. That is Ummagumma, and the tension between those two simultaneous truths is what makes this 1969 record the most honest and most disturbing object Pink Floyd ever produced. The question Ummagumma poses is not the one contemporary criticism wanted to answer. Not, is Pink Floyd brave enough to experiment? That is the question of someone who mistakes audacity for necessity. The real question is this: what remains of each musician when the protective shield of the collective is removed? And the answer the studio disc provides, 4 sides, each surrendered entirely to a single member, is as revealing as it is involuntary. None of the 4 intended to expose their limitations. All 4 did. But before reaching the collapse, one must understand what was being held together. The live disc, recorded in Manchester and Birmingham in April of 1969, documents a band operating with precise collective intelligence. Astronomy Domine opens with David Gilmour's voice superimposed on Roger Waters in a unison that is not harmonic but rhythmic. Both voices arrive together as if drawn from a single lung, anchoring the modal progression in E minor with a solidity that conceals the complexity of what happens beneath. Gilmour's guitar moves in Dorian mode, with chromatically expanded borrowings. The A-flat that surfaces in the second melodic phrase does not belong to the mode, but is absorbed by the progression as unresolved tension that pushes the listener forward without their knowing precisely why. It is the choice of a guitarist who thinks harmonically before thinking technically. Gilmour never resolved that tension because the tension was the point. Nick Mason constructs the Astronomy Domine groove with a snare pattern displaced from the downbeat that generates a persistent sensation of gravitational lightness, as if the music were perpetually one step from floating out of the bar without ever quite doing so. The technique is not complex in terms of rhythmic density, but is extraordinarily precise in terms of placement. Mason plays slightly behind the beat consistently, producing what jazz drummers call layback, an effect that British psychedelic rock of the period rarely employed with this degree of consciousness. Richard Wright inhabits the space between the guitar and Waters' bass, with farfisa chords that do not fill but suggest, open voicings in tenor position that leave the middle register deliberately empty, producing a texture that sounds wider than its separate components would justify. It is the kind of orchestration that only works when the musician executing it knows exactly what the other 3 are doing at every moment. Wright was not playing chords, he was playing gaps. And Roger Waters, the Astronomy Domine bass line as performed live, is the clearest argument available for the proposition that the electric bass can function simultaneously as melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic instrument without compromising any of the 3 functions. Waters articulates the root line with a precision that contains nothing of technical virtuosity, no sweep picking, no slapping, none of the ostentations that later progressive rock would canonize, but carries a compositional intelligence that defines the harmony as much as the guitar does. The E pedal point he sustains through the modal progression of the central section is not merely tonal anchor. It is the assertion that a gravitational center exists even when everything surrounding it moves centrifugally. This cohesion, 4 instrumentalists who complete each other because each occupies exactly the space the other 3 vacated, is what the studio disc will systematically dismantle. Grantchester Meadows, Roger Waters' contribution, is the most revealing starting point because it is the simplest. Voice and acoustic guitar in E major, with field recordings made by Waters himself, crickets, birds, a bee whose buzzing grows until an abrupt silence followed by an amplified fly being killed. The formal structure is composed with strophic song elements. The verses repeat the I4V harmonic pattern in E major, but never return to the same instrumentation or the same dynamic, creating a progression that sounds static on the surface and is deeply linear underneath. What Grantchester Meadows reveals about Waters is precisely what contemporary criticism refused to see. Without the band, Waters is a chamber song composer with theatrical tendencies. The bee that becomes a dead fly is not Dadaist sophistication. It is literalism disguised as symbolism, the kind of gesture Waters would repeat on an industrial scale in The Wall a decade later. The difference is that in The Wall, the band, particularly Gilmour, filtered Waters' literalism through a musical sensibility that transformed it into something less didactic. In Grantchester Meadows, there is no filter. There is only the composer and his tendency toward explicit statement. Several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave and grooving with a pict, the longest title in the Floyd discography, is Waters without guitar, without melody, without conventional harmony. It is manipulated voice, body percussion, layered rhythms in different time streams that create a vocal polymetry where one voice operates in cycles of 5 pulses while another operates in cycles of 7, generating a pattern that coincides only after 35 pulses. The piece is genuinely innovative rhythmically and genuinely difficult to sustain as listening experience. Two facts that do not contradict each other and that criticism rarely admits simultaneously. Nothing reveals Waters more precisely than recognizing that he needed rock to have an audience, and needed the audience to have a purpose. Richard Wright's contribution, Sisyphus in 4 parts, is the highest point and the most problematic moment of the studio disc. Parts 1 and 2 establish a post-Debussy harmonic territory with whole tone chord progressions that dissolve functional tonality without replacing it with any coherent alternative system. What in Debussy was liberation from romantic chromaticism becomes in Wright an absence of direction that the composition does not acknowledge, but the listening ear feels. Part 3 abandons harmony entirely in favor of organized noise, piano cluster chords, bowed mellotron strings, textures that European musique concrète of the 1950s had explored with far greater methodological rigor. Part 4 returns to tonality with a progression in D minor that sounds like reconciliation after a quarrel whose causes no one remembers. Wright was the most harmonically sophisticated musician in Pink Floyd. Sisyphus proves that harmonic sophistication without formal architecture is vocabulary without syntax. Gilmour's contribution, The Narrow Way, in 3 parts, is the most honest piece on the studio disc precisely because it is the most modest. Parts 1 and 2 are guitar studies, overlapping finger-picked lines, creating multi-voice textures from a single instrument, with the open 3rd string functioning as a pedal drone, while upper voices modulate between A major and F sharp minor, with a naturalness that reveals a guitarist who thinks vocally. Part 3 is a song with lyrics sung by Gilmour that anticipates his most immediate solo work, harmonically conservative, emotionally direct, technically precise without being demonstrative. What The Narrow Way reveals is that Gilmour without Waters had things to say, but did not yet know exactly what. The technical sophistication was entirely present. The compositional argument was partially present. What was missing was the dramatic pressure that Waters provided, that tendency toward conflict and resolution that is the narrative engine of all subsequent Floyd work. The Grand Vizier's Garden Party by Nick Mason is 3 minutes and 41 seconds of solo percussion with flute played by his wife Lindy, and it is the most honest gesture on the entire record. Mason did not pretend to be a composer. Mason never pretended to be a composer. His contribution says exactly that. Here is the drummer, playing drums, without pretending this is more than it is. There is something profoundly respectable in that modesty, and something profoundly revealing about what the structure of Ummagumma demanded of all its participants, an exposure that only Mason had the honesty to make without disguise. What makes Ummagumma indispensable is not the quality of its parts. It is the clarity of what it reveals about the nature of the collective. Pink Floyd was not a band of individual composers who collaborated. It was an entity whose emergent properties depended on the simultaneous presence of all 4 members interacting in real time. When that interaction was removed, what remained were 4 musicians of variable quality, producing work of variable quality, which is entirely different from 4 quality musicians producing collective work of superior quality. Music theory has a name for the phenomenon, formal synergism, but the listening experience of Ummagumma dispenses with the nomenclature. One need only listen to Astronomy Domine live with the attention it deserves, and then listen to Sisyphus with the same attention. The difference is not one of style or ambition. It is the difference between a structure and its building materials. In 1973, when the dark side of the moon transformed Pink Floyd from cult band to global phenomenon, critics attempted to locate the seeds of that album in everything that had preceded it. Some pointed to metal, some pointed to Atom Heart Mother. The most perceptive pointed to Ummagumma, not for its achievements, but for its failures. Dark Side was born from the collective understanding of what happened when collectivity failed. It is an album about the disintegration of the mind, of time, of identity, themes that Ummagumma had touched not in lyrics, but in structure. The band that recorded Dark Side had learned from Ummagumma that the individual ego cannot sustain the weight of a complete vision, had learned that Waters needed Gilmour as much as Gilmour needed Waters, had learned that Wright was indispensable not despite his invisibility, but because of it. The space he left was part of the music as much as the notes he played. Had learned that Mason was the most underrated musician in British progressive rock, precisely because he never attempted to be anything other than what he was. Ummagumma is the album on which Pink Floyd learned what it was, and that learning cost an entire record of partial failures, uneven solos, and involuntary exposures, the exact price a band must pay to discover that it only exists when it is whole.